Welcome to this lecture in Human Geography, a taster lecture on the street and everyday life. My name's Dr Suzanne Reimer, and I'm going to talk you through some ideas that are a blend of some of the things we discuss in first year Human Geography about the street and public space, and also some of the things that we do in second year cultural geography, where we look at this idea of everyday life that I'm going to introduce now. I've chosen a particular background image for this opening slide. You might just have a quick think about whether or not you recognise it. And if you recognise it, where is it? This is the Ramblas in Barcelona, which you may have visited or you may have seen images of. Very much, I think, now a tourist street, although historically a space for local people from Barcelona to walk and parade in the summer sunshine. Okay, so in this taster session, we're going to be thinking about how we understand this idea of everyday life. And it's something that geographers and sociologists look at in the sense that we can focus on everyday spaces of daily activity that are often very much taken for granted, that we don't necessarily stop and think about. So having a look at everyday life in busy urban areas, bars and pubs and so on, and busy urban streets in the top image, or alternatively places that we just go every day and don't think very much about. We have a routine, we get on the bus, as in this image of the bus loop in Southampton University. Everyday life isn't just about the popular, if you like. It's not just necessarily popular culture. And everyday life means something that really everybody does. It's not just a particular class or social group. Politicians have everyday lives. Pop stars do. You and I do. We're looking here at everyday habitual practices, waiting for a bus, as we saw in the previous slide. Here, waiting in the airport, buying a coffee, commuting, shopping, day-to-day activities. These day-to-day activities, I'm very conscious, are very different for us now, at the minute, but we're thinking here about everyday habitual practices that in the past we would have definitely taken very much for granted. Okay, now this is an activity that I give to students in the second year, and I won't spend a lot of time necessarily talking you through every element here, but you can go away and have a look at these suggestions and write down what you think about everyday life. This is taken from a text, Horton and Craftel, which the reference will be at the end of this lecture. Okay, so how do everyday spaces work? This is what we really want to look at. How do everyday spaces conform to certain kinds of norms, certain kinds of rules? Who uses everyday spaces? Who's allowed to use everyday spaces? This is one of the ways in which we can think about them. Okay, so let's then focus particularly on the street. We can think about all sorts of different aspects of the street, and I want to talk you through some of those. First of all, we can think about very different physical environments. So we saw that particular image of the iconic, if you like, Ramblas of Barcelona. Here we have a few slightly more ordinary streets, if you like, but even ordinary streets are ordinary in different kinds of ways. They look different. If we're talking about back-to-back housing in, say, inner city Leeds, or if we're talking about large suburban housing estates with big detached houses and garages and so on. So very different kinds of physical environments make up the street. And if we want to think about what goes on in streets, we can think about what people do there, what are the social actions involved. And in addition to that, we can also think about how our ideas about the street are a mixture of what we have experienced in real life, but also the images that we get from a range of different media representations. We might get those from, something like the news, but we also might get representations from, say, television shows, for example. So we have this knowledge of how streets work, even if we haven't been to these particular kinds of streets. So I've just got a couple of images here, which you may want to think about whether or not you know where they are. They're from a couple of 90s television shows. On the left, Sex and the City, where Sarah Jessica Parker's character lived. On the right is the image of the outside image, if you like, that is in the opening sequences of Friends. So these different kinds of streets in New York, we may get images in our head of because we've seen them on television regularly and again, and they may become very real to us. The idea of the brownstone terrace on the left-hand image from Sex and the City, this idea that you walk down onto the street from a higher level, and you have a kind of platform, if you like, where you enter into the public world. This isn't something that we see quite so much in other places. It's quite a distinctive feature of New York streetscapes, but a particular kind of New York streetscape and a particular type of housing style in New York. Okay, I want to go back now into the history of understanding urban streets and go back to George Simmel, sociologist. You may have encountered the idea of Simmel's ideas. Louis Wirth also you may have heard of. If you did A-level sociology, you may or may not know these names. Streets in urban areas at the turn of into the 20th century, so 1903 here, George Simmel is writing, streets at this time were very different, and rapidly urbanizing areas were leading to the experience of everyday life changing for many people. Let's have a look at this particular quotation here. This is something that we often do in lectures. We take some writing by a particular author or thinker and go through and have a look at the detail of it. Okay, so Simmel is writing about the very busy urban streets that were emerging. The rapid crowding of changing images, the sharp discontinuity in the grasp of a single glance, and the unexpectedness of onrushing impressions. These are the psychological conditions which the metropolis creates. With each crossing of the street, with the tempo of economic, occupational and social life, the city sets up a deep contrast with small town and rural life with reference to the sensory foundations of psychic life. So Simmel here is very much emphasizing the way that we feel very differently about our being in this busy, noisy, crowded environment. Lots of people were moving to urban areas, of course, from rural areas, and so therefore they were having this challenge to, as he says, the sensory foundations of psychic life, because their experiences were very different from the small rural villages that city dwellers had come from. So here's this idea of urban areas, urban streets being very different, and how this difference emerged. to think about this in image terms, this is a woodcut that was from Louis Wirth, another sociologist, a woodcut that appeared in his 1920s book, The Ghetto, where in particular parts of Chicago, different groups were clustering for work and housing. And this just gives you an image of the very busy, crowded, congested urban street. Now, ideas of the street also are linked to ways in which we understand community. So often the street is thought of as the place where community is transacted, where community interaction happens. So the street is somewhere that's communal, it's not private, it's where people join together, they meet each other. And there's that idea as well, I think, that streets and your local street around your house is somewhere that historically, at least, would have been safe to walk and play, and people would have spilled out of their houses onto the street to meet each other, to talk to each other, mothers to look after their children, and so on. So this idea of community being, if you like, on the street was very important to understanding how communities work. Now, this might well be, well, it certainly is to some extent, a very romanticised idea of densely packed working class housing. Why were people outside on the street interacting and speaking to each other, mothers talking to each other and so on? Why were they doing that? Well, because they were getting out of very crowded, tiny, cramped houses. So this idea of community on the street might be a very romanticised view of crowded working class housing conditions. But this idea that people spoke to each other on the street, that they interacted in the street, and that the street is important to community, led to a particular kind of building style much later, in the bottom image, where modern architects designing new tower blocks to provide housing that was much needed had this idea of replicating street life. So you have this corridor, streets in the sky, they were sometimes talked about, where people's front doors faced out onto a communal area, and where people could then talk to each other and exchange discussions and interact in this communal way. What other kinds of things that we can we think about in terms of street use, especially street use historically? So in the opening image we looked at the Ramblas in Barcelona. I want to just now think about this idea of interacting on the street in public, particularly for purposes of display. So the image here is the early to later evening Italian passeggiata, where people are outside to talk to each other, to meet in social groups, to meet friends, to have ice cream, to have a drink, to interact and display. And many southern European cities have this sort of tradition of just walking and strolling in the cooler air in the evening. So we can use this idea as an example of how social relationships form and occur through the space of the street. The street's used in this particular sort of way. And as people use the street, as they walk through it and behave on the street, societies develop rules about how it's appropriate to behave or not to behave with others in public spaces. So we can think about streets as this moral locale, so a moral space where social order is displayed. The display of sociability, of talking to people, is important, and so you transact sociability on the street, whether you're shopping, whether you're just walking, whether you're having an ice cream, as I say. So you might think about this sort of experience and how different kinds of streets might have different behavior rules, if you like. How should we behave in different places? Another thing we can think about in terms of the street is how that sort of use of the street may have changed in different places over time. And we might think in somewhere like London, this is an image from London with very large cars dominating the street. So in an increasingly fragmented society, where people are going out of their house into their car, they're not walking on the street, they're driving somewhere. And how does our experience of the street change in this fragmented societies, where we use streets as somewhere to go through, to go shopping somewhere else, to go to work somewhere else, to go and do leisure somewhere else? Okay, so this is just a brief example of how we can think about this sort of change over time, where people aren't necessarily just confined to their local environment. And this final point at the bottom of the slide here, this idea of people who experience the street very differently, the homeless, for example, the idea of a street person, if you say somebody is on the street, means they don't have a home to go to, right? So these, as homelessness has been more visible and increased, this notion about what it is to live on the street has emerged, and so we use this idea of somebody who's on the street to refer to a particular kind of positioning economically and socially. Okay, so just a final discussion about using the street. We might think about our use of the street as negotiating. So we might talk about how different people negotiate the street. I mean, that means how they interact with the street, how they use the street. And the idea of negotiating is intended to show a certain level of agency, of action on the part of people who use the street. So people actively use the street differently. And here in this slide I've just distinguished between different uses of the street in terms of, say, urban streets versus suburban streets, and you might think about the differences between these. Urban streets have very often been the focus of discussion in geography, for example, going back to those very early images of Chicago and other rapidly urbanizing centers in Europe and North America. How were urban streets different? And there are lots of associations in terms of danger and fear. As a new experience, urban streets need to be policed. Urban streets are often associated with crime. Urban streets may be more likely to be unfamiliar if you were talking about cities where people are moving to a city and coming from somewhere else. So we have all sorts of associations with urban streets. Then we also have a contrast in suburban streets, which may be associated with moral order. So you may be more likely to know your neighbours on a suburban street, and they may be watching you. There may be informal monitoring and surveillance. Who's going out, who's doing that, who's having building work done, so on. There are certain kinds of regulations which come into play, particularly in suburban streets. It's not to say that there aren't regulations of urban streets, but in suburban streets there might be regulations about housing in terms of conservation areas, what you're allowed to do with your house. There may be other sorts of community regulations about what you are allowed to do on the street and what you're not allowed to do in particular neighbourhoods, for example. If there's a neighbourhood group that is enforcing regulations. Okay, so just to summarise then, we've looked at what we understand by this thing called everyday life. We looked at what that means. The main focus of the discussion was how everyday spaces work, and the street is a particular everyday space, the street as a locus of everyday life. I briefly talked about how the use of the street might be seen to change over time and place. And then finally I emphasised how individuals might negotiate or relate to this particular space of everyday life. Okay, and then what I do at the end of my undergraduate lectures is to give you some suggested further reading, and so I've done that here for this lecture. And thanks for listening, and hope you enjoy geography at Southampton.